Quick roll call. To my right, Mr. Joe Terry, Director of Public Works. To my left, Dean Veneman, Council President. Matt Zacher, Committee Member. Mayor Shane Blazer, Attorney Sue Schill, Patrick Delaney, Public Works Committee Member. Jay Bemke, Council Member. Joe Eichstead, City Engineer. Item number 1, called meeting to order. The meeting is now called to order. Item number 2, review an administrative appeal requested from the Mead Witter Foundation resulting from a denial of street privilege. The Mead Witter Foundation wishes to install private conduits in the West Grand Ave public street right away. Mr. Eichstead.
I could run through a brief introduction and give the committee some background and some information as to the decision for the denial, and then hand it back over. So initially, the Mead Witter Foundation contracted with Vanert Electric and Togstad Construction to perform work related to the park improvements along West Grand Avenue. Part of this contracted work was to install a private water line for irrigation and an electric power line for an irrigation pump. The engineering department received a right-of-way permit application and began working with the contractors to get a completed application in place. Prior to that point, contractors had installed the infrastructure across West Grand Avenue without a permit. This infrastructure consists of a 4-inch HDPE line, casing pipe for water, and a 1 1/4-inch conduit for 240-volt electric. The work performed without a permit is being addressed outside of this specific referral. However, it is pertinent background information. The Mead Witter Foundation subsequently submitted a street privilege application, which is a separate application from the right-of-way permit application, requesting that this infrastructure be allowed within the public right-of-way. So specific to the street privilege application, the denial of that application was based upon the following reasons. Primarily, it was determined to cause undue hardship and risk to the users of the public right-of-way, and was found to be contrary to the requirements set forth in Chapter 6 Right-of-Way Management, which is to provide the city a legal framework within which to regulate and manage the public rights-of-way, and provide for the health, safety, and welfare of the residents of the city as they use the rights-of-way of the city, as well as to ensure the structural integrity of the public rights-of-way. Specific reasons for denial include that this installation in the right-of-way is considered a new installation and was not pre-existing. We have a couple instances in the city on First Street North in the Historical Museum in which street privileges were approved to reinstate already existing irrigation lines. The installation has occurred illegally. Official letters from the engineering department have already been sent to private contractors hired by the Mead Witter Foundation to remove or abandon and remedy the illegal installation. The third item, the bore occurred within a 6-inch borehole. 2 conduits were pulled through that 6-inch borehole, leaving behind a significant amount of void space for future settlement that could damage the pavement and other infrastructure. Number 4, the irrigation line being a 2-inch line inside of a 4-inch casing, and then the 1 1/4 electrical conduit for 240-volt electric. The electric line and irrigation line pose a significant risk to the health, safety, and welfare of the public and users of the right-of-way. This asset is a private asset in the public right-of-way that is not governed by the Public Service Commission, and therefore puts an undue burden on the city as the right-of-way manager and other utility companies that have responsibilities for the infrastructure held in the public's trust. Additionally, Digger's Hotline does not mark private lines, and there is a significant risk to contractors and excavators digging and hitting this infrastructure. Lastly, Waterworks and Lighting Commission has confirmed that the electric utility services cannot be installed across properties not owned by the applicant, meaning the public right-of-way in this case, especially if utility service is available or accessible to both lots. That completes the background information and reasons for denial.
Thank you. Any questions or comments by the committee? Mr. Delaney?
I have a few questions. And I'll try to make this brief, but in order to make up my mind either way on this, I'd like to know specifically what undue hardship and risk is there posed to the users of the public right-of-way? That's a pretty broad term. It poses undue hardship and risk.
It's hard to say what the specific instances could be, but any electric line or irrigation line excavated, hit without being known. If there's workers that are nearby, pressurized pipe or electric line, if that were installed, there is a risk working next to things if it's not known that they're not there.
Let's see here. Is there any way to easily map this installation for when future work is done on the public right-of-way so that they would know that it's there?
Yeah, there is technology that would allow both tracing of lines such as this, as well as documenting horizontal and vertical locations of that infrastructure for incorporating into existing infrastructure maps and such.
In your thing here, it says that letters were sent out to private contractors. On what date did that, were those sent out for them to remove or / abandon the installation?
There were 2 letters sent out, one initial letter, and then there was a second follow-up. See if I can find the dates here offhand. So the initial letter is dated June 21st, and the follow-up letter was July 26th.
I'm sorry, did you say July 26th?
That's correct.
Okay, on your third reason here, it says that the 6-inch borehole is going to damage pavement. Is that the concrete roadway? Are you talking the sidewalks? Is this steel and reinforced concrete? Like, isn't that pretty substantial?
So the reason for that item is that typically you wouldn't bore a hole that you'd try to fit 2 smaller pipes in of differing sizes, because there's, of that 6-inch diameter, there's significant void space that's left. Typical compaction of road base is at 95% compaction. And so if you're leaving a significant amount of void space, however deep underneath the road structure, there is going to be some settlement. As far as what that causes for damage in the future or when it occurs, I mean, it's unknown, but it's something that you would try to avoid if at all possible.
Okay, so you sent out these letters to remove or abandon the installation. Wouldn't removing it cause further harm? So if it is going to be abandoned, or should we cap it and fill it with something, or what's the?
Yeah, there were provisions that were supplied with that documentation on options for the removal or remediation.
Okay, you also have that other infrastructure could be damaged. What other infrastructure are we talking about?
Any other public infrastructure that already exists out there. There's gas main, water main, storm sewer, sanitary sewer, any of that infrastructure is, I guess, has the potential to be impacted by it.
Okay. Referring to the additional reason, number 4, it cited that this poses a significant risk to the health, safety, and welfare of the public and users of the right-of-way. Can you explain these risks in detail, or is this just a reassertion of the first claim given in the initial first part of the denial?
It largely involves the fact that public utilities have, they're regulated by the Public Service Commission. They have a right to be in the public right of way, and they have an obligation to be part of the diggers hotline, have their utilities marked for the safety of people that are excavating within the right of way. They need to know where their infrastructure is. And the difficulty with private infrastructure is that it's not a public utility. It's not part of the diggers hotline locating service.
If I could extrapolate on that a little bit, for example, if We Energies wants to directionally bore a gas service, if Solaris or Rapids Waterworks and Lighting Commission wants to, run a fiber optic cable or an electric line or anything like that, there's no way of knowing where this private piece of infrastructure is. If they call Diggers Hotline, it's not located, and they could bore through it. They could make contact with it. There's any number of things that could happen that could cause life safety risk or risk to the infrastructure itself.
I had asked that before, if there is an easy way to map the installation for when future work was done, and he said that there was a way that it could be marked.
It could be mapped, but the issue is administration and logistics. If, the one call system in Wisconsin is what everybody uses. You call Diggers Hotline, stuff gets located, and that's it. Diggers Hotline does not locate private underground infrastructure. So if private underground infrastructure exists and Diggers Hotline doesn't locate it, while it may be on a map, a telecommunications contractor, utility contractor, We Energies, wouldn't necessarily know that it's there. So it can be on a map somewhere, easily accessible by somebody, but communicating that using the one call system can be challenging. And on private construction, that happens frequently. If there's redevelopment on a private lot, trying to understand and locate, all of the underground, if it's not well documented and well mapped. For example, when we were talking with Waterworks and Lighting about electrical and serving that across there, one of the engineers for Waterworks and Lighting had mentioned that, there's a significant power line that powers the county building that the mill owns, and the mill knows where it is, and yet their crews hit it. And it was theirs, right? But it's not part of the one call. It wasn't marked. It wasn't located. It was still hit and seriously damaged, and potentially could have, injured or killed somebody. So while mapping, it's easy. It's the logistics of making sure that everybody that has access to that right of way, everyone that has the right to use that right of way, knows where it is, what depth it is, so that when they're doing their work, their maintenance, adding, subtracting, modifying their underground infrastructure, that it's located, and that's the challenge.
Okay. I just have one more question. So you mentioned in here that on First Street North and the Historical Museum also had lines that were replaced. It's kind of a two-part question. Were new boreholes drilled for that, and did that installation of replacing existing lines cause any undue hardships or risk to health, safety, and welfare of the public that is currently using it right now?
Joe, would you mind answering that one?
So in those situations, I guess the way staff had looked at it is that those were existing facilities and did a similar process. The staff had made a recommendation. That recommendation came to Common Council. Common Council agreed, and the street privilege was approved. In those situations, it's an empty pipe. You know, it's similar in that they're being used for irrigation purposes. It's different that it's not, neither of those locations have, well, I mean, any underground infrastructure is significant, but it's perpendicular in both of those cases, perpendicular to the road. And if utility hits those, especially being that it's not power and it's in a straight line, it's a little more predictable if they see it and find it what it is. Whereas this directional bore, from the information that the city received, I think it varies from, was it 18 or 24 inches down to 6 or 7 feet. You know, it snakes across and at a diagonal. So, you know, for future users of the right-of-way, there's a lot to try to avoid there. It's not just, look, you need to worry about this thing, it's 33 inches deep and, you know, it's in a straight line. So there are differences. Both of those installations were a straight line. I think they're both just a piece of PVC. No power, no conduits, or no casings, just, you know, just a single piece of PVC going across the road.
And just to clarify on that too, they were open cut installations that were either tied to some form or fashion to a city project. So they weren't bored across, they were open excavated.
Did I hear you right, Mr. Terry? It's varied elevations on this boring that went across West Grand?
That's correct. That's the information that the city received. I don't know, do we have, you don't happen to have that handy, do you, Joe? But yes, that it was over some infrastructure and then turned and went underneath other stuff and was at a number of varying elevations as it went again diagonal across the road.
Do we know if there's any other private underground utilities that cross the right-of-way on West Grand?
I don't believe there are any that are permitted or that we're aware of. We did have a request a few years ago from, I think it was Wood County, to install fiber optic, and that request was denied.
So the boring depth information that we have is 18 inches over street light lines, 2 feet above Solaris lines, then to a depth of 8 feet 6 inches under gas, 7 feet to below drain, guessing that's the catch basin. And then Riverside, on the Riverside, 25% positive incline. That's the data that we have.
Any other questions by committee? Mr. Zacher?
Thank you. It seems like this is a pretty significant project. Like, this just didn't happen overnight and on a whim. Like, how would they have assumed that to do this kind of work was okay to do in the first place if it was such a huge project? In my mind, maybe it's not as huge as my mind thinks it is, but ultimately it seems like it's a really huge project. So how would they get it in their, Van Hert's a very respected company, like, where would they get it in their mindset or in their professional opinion that this was okay to do, and they've already done it, it's already in place, it's sound as far as it goes in terms of it didn't cause any structural damage to anything. How did they manage to do all this?
So the process to excavate or occupy the right-of-way is through a permit process. Permits were in stages of being applied for, and then the contractor went ahead and did the work prior to being, prior to receiving any permits at all. And in this case, when Joe said a significant void space, this directional bore, if you do the math, there's over 50% open space with a directional bore like that, unless there's other remedial efforts. So it is a significant amount of empty earth there that is going to get displaced and move around and potentially leave a space underneath or around other infrastructure that's there.
I guess in my research, I've heard different opinions about that, that there's other ways to do that. Like, these are professional companies. They know how to do it. I don't think they would, is there another way and how that would have been drilled or anything?
Absolutely. If you're going to put a borehole in, you put a single casing in it. You fill the borehole. You don't leave it empty and void. I would challenge any contractor to show us any specification that would allow a directional bore with 50% void space remaining. In this case, if you wanted to, you'd do something, you'd put a large casing in, and then you'd slip your internal conduits inside that, or you do two separate bores, one sized for each of the different pipes that would go across the street.
So, and we're absolutely sure, like, we're able to see how they did it underneath the street that says that this
That's what they've told us.
50%, there's 50% open space, you're saying, around the existing
Right.
yeah,
Yeah, that's simple
PVC
math.
that went through?
They identified the size of the bore, they identified the size of the conduits inside the borehole, and simple math tells you what the void space is. It's over 50%.
So what would we do if we pulled that PVC out then? What would we have to try to figure out how to fill it back in with something?
Yeah, they've been instructed to try to grout that. But even that process has to be done carefully with pressure grout. There's other utilities that have pressure grouted directional bores and have put too much pressure on it and then have displaced the ground around it out. So you're trying to take care of the void space so that stuff doesn't collapse around it. But there are some examples where it heaved up the road or heaved around other utilities.
So we're running a risk by taking it out, possibly.
We're running a risk just having it there as is right now. That has to be.
But we'd be running almost a bigger risk by taking it out.
No,
Because at
I
least
don't
right now, there's not that much. It's going to be a significant amount more to be displaced if we take it out.
The void needs to be taken care of. It has to be. That's our standard.
I go back to the other question. I don't know if there's any way to get an answer to this, but why would a company, like, if we knew that that there's absolutely no way we're going to allow a private line to go across the road in any way possible, why would we make them go through the permitting process and fill out all this paperwork, taking weeks and weeks of more and more paperwork, instead of saying, there's no way we're going to let you do this. Like, there's just no way it's going to happen, so you might as well not hand in any paperwork. As a business owner, I guess I'd be a little peeved if I spent a long period of time getting paperwork for something that was never going to be approved anyways.
Right, so our ordinance, Sue can answer that, sure.
Well, there never was a permit taken out to bore under the street and to place irrigation or anything under the street. That's undisputed until the street privilege. So the application that was applied for but never granted was to bore into the sidewalk to determine where the utilities might be under the street. Okay, so there never was a permit. And when we talked to Togstead, they said Van Aert was going to get it, and when they thought Van Aert was going to get it, and we talked to Van Aert, and they said Togstead was going to get it. And I don't think either one realized, and Mead Witter certainly didn't realize, that the permit was never actually applied for, to actually do that. The only permit was to bore down to see what utilities were there in anticipation of then probably doing excavation work. But I want to stress again that's the contractors. In good faith, we believe that Mead Witter, expected that they were going to get the permits and get the approvals, and that didn't happen. And now we're in the situation where, well, it's been done, and now what do we do?
So I'm to understand that what you're saying is the Van Aert never said we want to run a line all the way across the road on a diagonal to the river. That's the initial plan. That's why we're asking to bore down to find where all the utilities are, because we want to run a line right across the road.
Well, there's some dispute over who said what to whom, but they never filled out a permit and said, this is what we're going to do. In writing, we're going to do this. And when I talked to them, they both blamed the other for not getting that permit. I don't know if that's now not, but that's, the woman from Togstead said she would assume that Van Aert would do it as the general contractor, and Van Aert had said that they had assumed that Togstead would do it. And they both were surprised that neither one had done it. And so, like I said, that permit was simply to drill the holes and not to do the work under the street. And if I'm incorrect in that, please correct me.
So then, in my understanding, between Van Aert and the boring company, what was their name again?
Togstead.
Togstead, there was a failure to do their full work that they needed to do to make this happen. The Mead Witter Foundation had no knowledge necessarily of this the permit not being issued. And then all of a sudden, to our surprise, we have a line run all the way around the road, up and around all the utilities and to the river, so that we could actually make the project happen. It's already been done. That's kind of what I'm taking away from this at this point, right? Thank you.
Correct. Mr. Blazer.
I've talked boring quite a bit, and I've learned more about boring than I ever thought I would in my entire life. But I do have a question. So apparently they put a slurry mix in with the pipe for the pull? And is that a cementous mixture designed to potentially fill void space? No, unless you know about bore.
You want this one, Joe, or do you want me to take it?
I can cover it.
I've heard the word slurry, and I didn't know if that was a cementous mixture that would fill some of that void space.
It's a bentonite slurry. It's what's typically used. It's basically clay and water mixed together.
Okay. But it potentially could fill void space too.
Yeah, it's meant to hold the borehole open long enough so that they can pull the conduits through, or the casing pipes through. After which the water, will dissipate and leave, and there'll be some solids left behind, but not sure to what degree.
Okay. I kept hearing slurry. I didn't know if it was a cementous mixture. I guess if you will allow me to continue, there was this process has been going on for a while, and I think from the beginning, internally I've said, and I believe that we have two different issues here. We have an issue whether or not the question, and obviously there was no permits issued. How we got to that point was a windy road, but we keep talking about the contractors and those issues, but I believe and I support, the committee supporting the project and overruling the denial. But, ultimately the request is for a street privilege, and that's to deal with the pipe underneath. How we got there this is where we're at. But now it's, this body needs to decide whether or not we're going to allow that pipe to remain there and to be used for, I think, a civic purpose without personal capital gain to anybody, that this will be a great project for the downtown, and that's where I kind of sit, and that's my opinion on it. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments, Mr. Delaney?
Is there anybody here from Mead Witter that would like to speak? Do you have any evidence or do you have anything to add to this?
Mr. Johnston, correct? Sure.
Sean Johnston, I'm the president of the Mead Witter Foundation. So I guess I want to reaffirm why I'm here. Not necessarily to argue the technical data, but I think there's a misrepresentation of how we arrived at a boring happening under the road. I mean, we hired several months ago a reputable contractor. There were communications with the city. Now, we'll concede that the permit was not in hand, but there were several communications, and am I able to share any type of these communications with the committee?
By all means.
So what you have there, the first is a letter of testament from Togstead Boring addressing the issue of annular space. I'm not an engineer, I don't do that, but they do. It should explain to you or address some of the concerns regarding what the process was, how I mean, that they do this every day. I would ask you to take a look at that particular piece of information. The other packet that I'd handed you is the communication chain that existed prior to the excavation or the directional boring in the right-of-way. So I think it would be an unfair representation that the city was entirely unaware just because the permit wasn't pulled. I mean, there's a map that says Mead Witter bore going across the road, and that was in the city's hands 2 weeks prior to the excavation. We think what we're trying to do is provide a public asset. We hired reputable contractors. This wasn't a fly-by-night operation. Somebody wasn't water jetting under the road. We felt that this was done in the most appropriate way possible. We recognize that there was not a permit in hand. We're here as the owner of the property asking that for permission to continue to use the line. It's in the ground. We hope that it'll be something that is good for this community. I'm happy to answer. I mean, there's a lot of stuff out here to think about, so I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have of me.
I have a question, if that's all right.
Mr. Terry first.
So if another utility needs to expand or move their, their conduits or their infrastructure, how are they supposed to know yours is there, and what will you do to move yours to accommodate them?
We're not asking for special privileges. We're asking for the same consideration that Historical Society and anybody else who has an infrastructure in the road. If it's on city GIS, it's my assumption that the city would mark that if a digger's call came in for that property. The same with the storm sewer. I mean, we don't think this is an impossible thing to overcome. If somebody wants to come expand, and I mean, those are all things you address at those times, but they don't at the moment, as far as I understand.
So is there there's obviously water main around the area. The purpose of directional bore and pulling water from a different piece of property versus drilling a well or using city water?
Well, the reason that you permitted the Historical Society is because they did drill a well, and there was an adverse result to that. Entirely different geography on this side of the river, as you know. The infrastructure that exists servicing that lot is insufficient for the park plan that was put together. We were assured by a contractor that they could do this. It's how we arrived at that decision to invest thousands of dollars in the design and the plantings that would go in the park.
So the water main isn't sufficient to, because
The water laterals that service the property.
okay.
I mean,
Mr. Delaney.
On page 6 of our packet is a document with the heading disclaimer, permit expires 60 days after issuance unless otherwise stated in this permit. First line of the document reads, I, the undersigned, and it says permit holder. Nowhere on this does it say permit applicant. Says that this person holds a permit of some sort. I would think that would have to do with the right-of-way permit application. I don't understand this document. I'm wondering, did you think you had a permit at the time that this was done?
No, we didn't think we had a permit. This was the vector by which we would be considered for use of the infrastructure that exists in the ground today and at the time of this application, or going through this vector of arriving before somebody to consider the street privilege. Initially, what was taken out was a right-of-way management permit, is my understanding.
How did you come to decide to go down and take out a permit on the 28th of?
At the direction of city staff. We had been in discussions with the mayor and others that this is, how do we fix this problem that's been in existence for 9 weeks? This was what the Historical Museum was permitted by. We decided that this would be a way of getting this venue, this audience to find a way to utilize the infrastructure.
Mr. Blazer.
Joe, our right-of-way management ordinance is an ordinance that was adopted by council. This isn't state law, this isn't PSC rules that we can't have private crossings because other communities, I'm thinking, allow private crossings. It's on a community-by-community basis. Or is this a standard through the state of Wisconsin that there are no private crossings through the right-of-way?
So the right-of-way management ordinance is specific to public utilities, and the street privilege application, that provides a mechanism for express privileges for private use. But typically, those things are largely temporary in nature. But there are like construction fencing for a construction project, things they got to put in the right of way temporarily for the duration of their work to assist in it, or dumpsters in the street, things like that. That's typically what we see applications for.
My question is broader than that, though. Our ordinance that governs our right-of-way is our ordinance. It's not a state law. It's not PSC rules. This is something our council adopted specifically for our community on right-of-way management. It's not, you can go to point and maybe they allow private crossings. It's up to each individual municipality, correct?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, largely across communities, private infrastructure in the right-of-way is typically frowned upon. I'm not saying that there aren't instances where it is approved, and maybe Sue can speak more to the state statutes and such, but.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to point out that I think the ordinance is specific to our community, and each community can adopt their own ordinances to govern their right-of-ways.
Mr. Zacher?
What size wire, there's water coming through this? And then there's, you said there is one wire for a pump that's going to be in the park that's pulling the water through? It's not pushing from the other side? Do I understand that right? There's going to be one wire coming through that conduit?
That was how this was initially designed. We have no desire to make this a public safety hazard. We don't believe it is. But if the power is the concern, and if that is something that is what really makes this the concern to public safety, if somebody's excavating, they hit a power line, we'll concede the power, we'll get it from somewhere else, we'll use the infrastructure for a low voltage signal wire and pump the water, yes, across into the developed park.
The reason I asked the question is I'm assuming it's a low volt, not low voltage, but it's not a.
It can be either, yes, the wire could be either. In this instance, it could either be, you could supply power from the park side, but there's a concern with that. That's presented in the denial. We could modify that in such a way that it would be low voltage wire, so signal wire.
Yeah,
And
I'm just saying is,
water, yeah.
what I'm trying to get at is it a risk or not? And if it's just water and it's not the electric, then there's no risk, except for to the Mead Witter Foundation, when the road gets tore up again, basically they, the city and WWLC has to say, like, if we tear it up, it's on you guys, it's not on us. And, like, we just have to redo it at that point in time if we sign the permit and everything else. But the risk itself is to, like, going into it and creating a massive personal hazard to somebody is not really there, because the wires the electricity to run the pump isn't very much, whether it's being pulled to the park or being pushed to the park, either way.
Right, and
That's not-
and the option to not have alternating current voltage or 240 volts under the road. Now that if that is the preferred method, then it would be even less of a concern. It would be low voltage signal wire for controlling valves.
Thank you.
My understanding is that Waterworks and Light would not approve the installation of a private electric line across public right-of-way. So that's obviously something that's going to have to go through the right channels there as well. Hypothetically, if we were to approve just this irrigation line minus the electrical lines, can we cover the conditions of approval? Mr. Eichstad?
As far as, if that were the scenario, if the committee approved, what sort of conditions would be put in place?
Correct.
At least from staff recommendation, I do have a list of items that would be under consideration. First off, insurance as required per the street privilege requirements. Additionally, because of the significant void space and the potential risk and damage to city infrastructure as well as other public utility infrastructure, something we need to look at more closely here yet, but some sort of payment in lieu of remediation of that void space. Degradation fees that would need to be paid for damage to the concrete panels that had three potholes cored through them. There would be a 10-day notice of termination as specified in the street privilege requirements. The applicant would be liable and responsible for all damages and injury. We'd have to try to attempt to file with have the applicant file with Diggers Hotline to be notified of locate requests in the vicinity of this line and promptly mark the facility. I'm not sure if that would entail some sort of long-term contract with the utility locator. In addition, there'd be provisions for properly abandoning these lines in the event that certain circumstances occur, such as the line being damaged or otherwise requiring repair, that the line needs to be relocated due to other public utility needs. that the line becomes unsafe for continuous operation within the public right-of-way. Excavations for abandonment cannot occur within the right-of-way. All abandonment shall occur using watertight, soil-type caps. And then tracer wire would be required, as well as fully documenting the vertical and horizontal location of the infrastructure at a location and depth recorded every 5 feet along the conduit length. That's the list of the conditions that we would be looking to pursue.
Any other questions or comments by committee? How about council members? Mr. Vanneman, Mr. Bemke, anything?
Seems like they're being pretty accommodating on what we need to do. It's an awful night. Tend to agree with the mayor on this. It's a good project for the city, and I'm in support of doing everything we can to work this through.
Mr. Bemke?
I guess I do have some concerns with the power coming across with the 240 volts. I think if you can work around that, as far as I'm concerned, the pipe is already there. If there has been damage done, it's already been done. I think we've outlined a list of things to mitigate some of that, and I think if these things are agreeable, I would be in agreement with going ahead with this, so thank you.
What are the committee's wishes?
I make a motion to leave the PVC pipe underneath the road the way it is and allow the Mead Witter Foundation to run their irrigation through there in hopes of electrifying the pump from somewhere on the other side of the road, so that's not being run under the road.
Does that sum it up, Attorney Shaw?
Right, would you, so when you are specifically addressing with the conditions as outlined from the engineering department?
Yes.
And would that include that there could be a low voltage line there or not?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Do I have a second? I'll second. Any other discussion? Any other questions?
Is there any way to this project, obviously was in discussion with the city. The city knew what they were going to do. They did it. If it was me, I would just continue as planned with the 240 volt line. That's otherwise everything that Matt had said.
I think I can understand the hazard with the 240 volts included in the conduits or next to the conduits with the irrigation lines. I think if you take that out of the equation, that makes it much easier to swallow, in my opinion. So in my mind, I think there's other ways to get power to where you need it to facilitate what you need. So I would have to hold strong, in my opinion, on leaving the power out of the equation on this bore line. Any other comments or questions? All right, we'll take it to vote. All in favor, please respond with aye. Aye. Opposed? Ayes have it. All right, item number 3, adjournment. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll motion to adjourn.
Second? All in favor? Aye. Meeting is adjourned at 5:50 PM. Thank you, everyone.